So apart from the shaders we can add, let's have a look. Add shaders. I'll say once again we'll go to some of these. Not all of these we can use for baking textures, but we'll go to some of these later on. Apart from adding shaders, we can also add a lot more kind of things. Okay, and the interesting one here is going to be texture. Okay, so we got a number of different types of texture we can add. So I think for the minute we'll go full screen with this, and we'll add a few of these textures and we'll play around with them and see what happens. So Shift A, add a texture. We can add a brick texture. That's an interesting one. Checker we know about. Well, checker we can guess what it is. Environment is what we use for HDRs. We're going to leave that alone for a minute. Gradient is just a plain gradient. Okay, well, in the interest of going through all of this, image texture we've done before, like adding a brick to a wall or something from a brick texture we already have. We've got a magic texture. Musgrave. These next couple can be interesting. Musgrave, noise, point. I'm going to leave it alone for a minute. Point is more to do with volumetrics, for kind of smoke and things like that. Sky, just we're going to leave alone for a minute. We'll add a Veroni and we'll add the wave texture. Okay, so from the texture list we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8 of them here we can play with and kind of see what they do. Right, where should we start? Let's start with the Veroni. Veroni is a very kind of interesting texture. It's kind of like a how to explain this? It's kind of like a cell structure. Okay, one of the things with the node wrangler is if I got a texture selected, if I control shift and left click, it'll add a viewer node so I can see what it's looking like on my model. Okay, and you can see here what I was talking about with the cell texture. Let me control Z back out of that, and I think for the minute let's add a plane. So shift C to center my 3D cursor, shift A, let's add a plane and let's scale this up. Actually, let's rotate it on a Z and let's scale this up a bit so we've got more to look at. G, shift Z, just want to move it back there a bit like that. Okay, and let's add a new material for this. So add a new material slot, and we had a Veroni texture, I think was what we was looking at. So texture will add a Veroni to this. Okay, so if I control shift left click to add that viewer node, so this Veroni texture is going to show on this plane. And if I come back to Suzanne, I've got rid of that viewer mode, so just on this red and white gloss, that's fine. Let's have a look at this and see what we get. You can see clearer this kind of cell structure on the plane. Okay, if I was to get rid of that viewer node and plug my diffuse back into the material output, and then plug the color of the Veroni into the diffuse, this will then make this cell pattern again once it reses, or once it renders rather, more accurately. So okay, that's that. If we wanted to increase or decrease the size of this thing, we can add a mapping node. It's the same as we did before with the texture node. With this selected, and node wrangler enabled, simply press Ctrl T to add a mapping node, and then we can change the scale of things. So let's bring that down to about 10. So now we've got this smaller cell kind of structure. Right, okay, what use is this to us? Well, let's go back into, well, let's select Suzanne and our Suzanne node setup. Let's just bring this across a bit. Give ourselves a bit of room here. Okay, so if we had this Veroni texture, which was there, let's bring this across. Okay, so we can leave those others out of view for the minute. If we were to add this into here somehow, there's a couple of ways it could work, a couple of places we could plug it in. Okay, now with nodes, you'll see the outputs and input sockets have different colors, and generally speaking, the same color goes to the same color, like for like. There are exceptions to this, but that is the general rule. So if you're wondering what to pick up and where to plug it in, you can go by the colors. Right, so if I was to add the color into the color of the diffuse, we'd get the same kind of thing. It's bigger because I haven't added a mapping node. I'm going to cut this connection. To cut a connection, it's Control and left click drag to sever that connection. Okay. We could add it into the mix shader as a factor. We've got a spare socket here and we've got a factor socket here. So let's add that in, see what happens. Okay, and what we're getting here is the gloss is coming through on top of the red diffuse in the shape of the Veroni texture. The scale's very big, so let's increase that quite a lot. Let's say about 50, and you might be able to see that clearer. Okay, so we're getting this kind of spotty effect, but it's still not recognizable to me as something I'd want to use somewhere. But when you look at this kind of cell structure, it reminds me a lot of leather. So what we could actually do is plug this factor into the displacement, and it will make the surface appear like it's picking up this cell structure, a bit like a leather cell structure. Okay, so if I take that out from there and I put that into the displacement, okay, now we see that it looks to be, it appears to displace the surface of Suzanne, but it's not actually displacing the surface. It's just a texture generated thing. The geometry hasn't changed at all. Okay, this is all very big, so we probably need to go, let's try 200 to get a more kind of a leather grain kind of effect. Okay, just move some of these out of the way a little. That's more, but it's very strong. And it also, let me zoom in a bit closer and wait for it to render up a bit. It's also facing the wrong way. The peaks are kind of like where I'd want the troughs to be, and vice versa. So we probably need to invert this. We can do this. So if we add, or Shift A, and is it under converter? Vector, possibly. But I get lost here sometimes. Right, it's not under texture. It's invert the color. It's under color. Okay, so the blacks become whites in that texture, and the whites become black, and this should swap around this high and low thing. So where was I? Shift A. It was under color. Invert, and we'll drop that into this Veroni displacement. Okay, and wait a couple of seconds for this to render up. But you can see already how it has inverted it. We've kind of swapped the blacks and whites, so that the grain structure, the cell structure of the leather is more as expected. You know, we'll get these high points that are glossy and the low points which are obviously darker, but it's very rough. So we need to find a way to control that. So if we need to control that, we've got the inversion factor. That factor is only going to affect the changeover between the darks and lights, and if I put that down to about halfway, a 0.5, you'll see that it's having, or it should have, no effect, because the blacks and whites are all the same now. They're at half and half. Okay, so if I do it the other way, it should come down to what we had, where we had the kind of ridges and stuff that we didn't want. So we've got some control over that with the inverter. Okay, what I want to do is control the power of this, how much the white parts of the texture, these parts of the texture, are coming up and showing on this gloss. So I need to drop something in here to control that. So Shift A, and it'll be a converter and a math node. Okay, so if I drop the math node in, you'll see it's set to add, but I've got all of these. What I actually want here is multiply. Okay, and the reason for multiply is because it gives me a value between 0 and 1. Actually, the value go a lot higher than 1, go to whatever you want. But if you think about when you multiply something by 1, it doesn't change. 5 times 1 is still 5. But you can use the decimals to reduce the power. So I can change this to, well, it's already set at 0.5, and you can see already, if I set this at 1 again, you'll see the difference. And hopefully this will render up fairly quickly. Just checking something up here. Let me change to GPU. Should be a bit faster. You may not have this GPU device. It depends if you've got an NVIDIA graphics card or not. So that's set to 1. We've got quite high. If I want something a lot lower, say 0.2, I don't know if you're seeing much difference there. Personally, I'm not. It's looking pretty much the same. So let me go much lower. And this is a thing with nodes. Sometimes you just got to experiment. You know, you get your idea, you've got your experiment, you want to just play around with some values and see if it's making it better or worse, or and until you get the result you want. So I'm there at 0.2. Let me try 0.05. Okay, already I can see this is smoothing out a lot, which I what I wanted. You know, I didn't want these big heavy grains, and even that's looking high. So 0.02. And wait a minute for this to render out. And straight away I can see we're only at 3 samples out of 32 at the minute. I can see that's much more like I wanted. Just going to wait for this to render out fully so it will show up better on the video. Okay, we've got this much kind of smoother leather. It's a rough grain leather, but it's this much smoother. It's not so high on the peaks and troughs. They're much closer together by using this multiply node. Okay, that's looking a lot better. The grain is looking big up here. It's looking okay down here, but don't forget we zoomed in very close. So let me kind of zoom out a bit and see how the overall model looks. Right, it's coming together quite nicely. I'm getting this kind of roughness on the leather that I was looking for. It's starting to look like a leather basically, which is what the point was. Do I need to do anything more to that? No, I don't. If you've got your video shown at full screen, you should be able to see the graining in the leather here. We could change the size of the grain with the scale of the Veroni texture, make it rougher or smoother. We can control the depth of the grain with this multiply factor. Okay, we can add more gloss to it if we want. So let me grab this gloss and bump it up to 0.2, 0.21. So we got more of this kind of a shiny leather, a polished leather. Yeah, that's coming together. We can see where it's picking up the specular, but it's keeping the grain, and it's once again looking like a leather. Red leather we don't see much of. We could go any colour. We could go a kind of tan colour. A bit more yellow, I think. There's somewhere around there. So we've got this kind of rawhide tan type of colour. We could even go with a black leather. Seems to be a popular colour for leather, doesn't it? Between shoes and jackets and purses or handbags or wallets or whatever. And actually black is showing this grain pretty well. Okay, so simply by adding a generated texture, this Roni texture, and a couple of nodes just to control it, we've managed to create this leather look. Okay, we'll stop there and then we'll try something else in a minute.